With Mike D'Antoni being back into the news as a possible head coaching candidate for a plethora of teams who are going to have openings throughout this offseason, we already know a couple of the teams that have openings. I would really be shocked if teams like Minnesota, Charlotte, the Utah Jazz, the New York Knicks, even the Brooklyn Nets to an extent, all don't have a head coach vacancy by the time the offseason is in full swing. And Mike D'Antoni, whether you want to admit it or not, his offensive system, his mindset of how he wants to maximize as much as possible the offensive side of the ball and not worry as much on the defensive side of the ball. Listen, understandably, if you don't like his sort of philosophy around basketball, I understand it. But you also have to understand the coach, even though he might say things like, we're going to, be the best offensive team in basketball, even if he's saying we want to be good on offense, we don't care about defense, it's up to the players to be able to play some defense. And there's some sort of personal, I don't know if I want to say pride, but there's a personal respect to yourself to play defense when you're in the NBA. When you're playing basketball in general, if you're just getting cooked on the defensive side of the ball, play in and play out, as someone in high school who got cooked on defense, play in and play out, there's a sort of respect that you will not garner by your teammates or the opponents that are cooking you, play in and play out. So with all that being said, Mike D'Antoni, I think right now as a head coaching candidate, is probably the best option that any of these teams have to take. Because listen, a lot of these teams that are going to have head coaching vacancies are teams that did not end on the sort of note that they would have wanted to. And one team that I think really needs to consider getting Mike D'Antoni is the LA Lakers. Now, Mike D'Antoni and the Lakers already have a stint together, even though it wasn't really a full season. Mike D'Antoni took over that Kobe Bryant, Pau Gasol, Steve Nash, Metta World Peace, Dwight Howard team. What was that, 2012, 2013? And that wasn't even a full season for him. That was a season in which he took over after the first 9 games when, Mike Brown got fired after 5 games. It just wasn't a functional franchise for a little while. And even in saying that, he took over a team who at the time was 5-5, and they end up going 40-32 over the last 72 games, make the playoffs as, I believe, an 8th seed. And, I'm not going to go as far as to say that they would have beat the San Antonio Spurs if Kobe Bryant doesn't get injured that year. But I will go as far as to say that Kobe Bryant would at least been enough for them to win 1 or 2 games against the Spurs and not get swept out of the playoffs. This is a different team as well with the LA Lakers. It's about a 10-year difference in rosters. This team has LeBron. This team has Russell Westbrook. This team has Anthony Davis. And I think, there's a lot of similarities between this team in the LA Lakers right now that there were with the Phoenix Suns team that Mike D'Antoni coached with Steve Nash as the point guard. I think there's some similarities even to the Houston team that Mike D'Antoni was coaching with James Harden and those guys. But similarities aside, I think the real reason that Mike D'Antoni should be the head coach of this team is because I think, listen, I'm not going to go as far as to say that LeBron James doesn't respect the head coaches of his teams. But you look at the track record of head coaches that LeBron James has had, they're not very, besides Frank Vogel, besides Eric Spoelstra, and besides Tyronn Lue, I would say that there's almost every single coach that he has had, whether it's David Blatt, whether it's Luke Walton, whether it's, and there's not, I'm not going to sit here and tell you there's like 15 different coaches, but there's like 8 or 9 coaches, and there's only really been 3 of them that LeBron James, I would say, has fully respected. And like I said, it's Lue, it's Spoelstra, and it's Frank Vogel to an extent. Now, Mike D'Antoni, I think, out of every single possible head coach candidate that the Lakers could hire, whether it's Jay Wright coming from the NCAA ranks, whether it's one of the guys that gets fired from any of these other teams, if it's Quinn Snyder in Utah, James Borrego in Charlotte, Thibodeau in New York, Steve Nash in Brooklyn, which that's an interesting one as well, or Chris Finch in Minnesota. But I think Mike D'Antoni, not only is he the most respected out of any of those guys as an NBA coach, he's the most battle-tested. He's the most veteran head coach out of any of those guys, and he has seen a lot of things in the NBA, and he knows how to get players to play above expectations. That's why Houston was always competitive with him. That's why Phoenix was one of the best teams in the NBA with him as the head coach. And I think with this team, they need to have a voice that is preaching get up and down the fucking court as quick as possible. Because I think one of the major problems with the Lakers is they love to walk up and down the court. And it's kind of led by LeBron. It's been the one thing over the past 2 years where it's like, okay, LeBron's kind of losing it for me in the GOAT conversation. Because I am one of the few people who will come on here and tell you, I think LeBron James is a better basketball player than Michael Jordan. But when I see LeBron walking up and down the court, that's where it starts to get like, okay, you're losing it for me here, bud. And Mike D'Antoni, and I think LeBron's kind of set in his ways at this point because, his whole career, he's one of the best players in the NBA. In his mind, he probably can afford to take a play or two off on the offensive or defensive side of the ball. But with Mike D'Antoni as the head coach, he at least is going to be preaching to the front office, do not sign these old fucking players so I can get some guys that are going to want to run up and down the floor. I want to get some guys who can get some shots up quick. I want to get some guys that if we don't make a shot, they have a chance to at least get 3 or 4 guys back in a transition standpoint and defend the basket at all times. And again, this Lakers team, they're not that far away from being back in the finals. You have 2 of the top 10 players in the NBA when they're healthy, between LeBron and Anthony Davis. There is a conversation to be made that they're 2 of the 5 best players in the NBA when they're healthy for a full season, and they're giving you everything they got. If you surround those guys with agility, with speed, with a little bit more size, and some shooting, this team is right back where they want to be. And Mike D'Antoni, I think, is the perfect head coach to try to orchestrate this, to construct this, to be a voice in the ear of the front office that they actually need to be hearing. I think the front office has heard a little bit too much from LeBron over the past 3 seasons. I think they need somebody to come in and say, no, this is what I want to see on the court because I'm the fucking head coach. And if I have players on the court that I don't want to be playing, then I'm never going to be able to run sets that I want to run. I'm never going to be able to have, certain mismatches that I ever want to have. I'm never going to have certain plays that I want to run because the front office is listening to one of the players on, team roster construction instead of themselves and the head coach. I think Mike D'Antoni is the perfect head coach for this Lakers team. He has a background that doesn't emphasize as much on defense, which at this point the Lakers, I think, would welcome. And he has a proven track record of making teams play better than what their roster says. And out of every other head coach that the Lakers could sign to be the guy in LA, I don't see another head coach who is as good of a candidate as Mike D'Antoni.